Okay, thank you guys for joining us today, and thank you, Elena, for the wonderful introduction there. I'm Stephen Elmlinger, and I study the emergence of vocal communication in human infants, with a particular focus on the context of parent-child interaction. So today I'll show you that children's vocal production actually elicits simplified speech structure in caregivers' responses. And that we're finding that this is the case across multiple cultures, including the Tseltal Mayan and English-speaking communities. So developmentalists have long been interested in cultural similarities and cultural differences in caregiver talk directed to children. Last week, a paper came out interested in similarities in the prosodic modifications of child-directed talk across multiple cultures. Their focus was on the seemingly widespread patterns of these pitch excursions used when talking to children. But you can also look across multiple levels of speech organization. So we can look at the utterance level to study the lexical and syntactic properties of child-directed speech. We can look at the real-time properties of the context or the pragmatics of child-directed speech, such as the speech rate, who the speech is being addressed to, and then conversational alternations between speakers. So our analysis today is going to focus on these two levels here. So the lexical and syntactic levels of caregiver speech, because this is where the statistical structure of one's ambient language actually comes from. And during social interaction, vocal turn taking, because this is the central context in which language learning gets done. So in particular, we want to understand the wide cultural variation we see in talk directed to children. In the Tseltal Mayan group that we'll be talking about today, caregivers use talk which is not necessarily tailored to the language learning of the children. But interestingly, Midi Casillas, our collaborator on this project, has shown that these children appear to learn language at similar rates to what's seen in children who actually experience ambient caregiver talk, which is more tailored for their learning. So this is a puzzle that we really want to understand, because these cross-cultural similarities and differences across these different levels of speech might actually be dissociated from one another, right? So you get exaggerated pitch contours in one culture, but not the other, but then actual convergence at these other two levels of language across different cultures. And so we think that studying social interactions might prove to be quite informative here. So our approach is to organize caregiver speech into two categories. One where speech occurs within vocal turn taking with their child on the left here. The yellow blocks are caregiver speech over time, children's vocalizations in purple. And I'll be calling speech inside of vocal turn taking contingent speech for the rest of the talk. So contingent utterances from parents occurred within 2 seconds of their child's vocalizations. And what we'll do is compare the speech structure we see there to speech where caregivers' speech occurs outside of vocal turn taking. So if parents' speech occurred after 2 seconds of a child's vocalizations, we're calling that non-contingent. And our research question is, does the content of caregivers' speech change as a function of its contingency on children's vocalizations? And I'll show you the kinds of caregiver speech structure that we're actually going to compare today. So first, the lexical diversity of speech. So for example, mom playing with her infant says, "Oh, here, right here." This is a count of 3 unique lexical items in the utterance, because here is repeated twice. Second is the mean length of utterance in words. So this is literally just a count of the total number of words in the utterance. And then finally, the proportion of single word utterances in the caregiver's speech. So the higher this proportion here, actually the more simplified it is. So what do we find when we compare these measures across contingent and non-contingent speech? Across these 3 measures, when we look at English-speaking caregivers in Ithaca, New York, when they responded to their infants, their speech content is simplified. So first, here on the left is the number of unique words. Along the y-axis, contingent speech is in red, non-contingent speech is in gray. And then in the middle here, the mean length of utterance in words, contingent versus non-contingent. And then finally, On the far right here, the proportion of single word utterances. So further up on the y-axis here is the higher likelihood of an utterance, just one word, and that means it's more simplified. So each of these are showing this simplification pattern when contingent on a 9-month-old infant's babbling. So we think this is an interesting finding. Infants can actually simplify their learning environments just by babbling. But it also generates lots of new questions, right? Among them is whether this effect is actually stable across various language learning environments for these infants. So a sneak peek into some ongoing work that we're doing, we looked at these same 3 measures in transcripts on the Childers database across 14 languages. Those languages are color-coded and plotted here across the globe. And the children in this data set are between 5 and 30 months of age. And here I'm summarizing what we found across those 14 languages. So these green check marks here are the instances where we found a simplification effect of contingent speech. Right, so this indicates that infants' vocalizations actually elicited simplified content in the speech of their caregiver's response in a given language. Right, what we're seeing by and large across these comparisons is that contingent speech is simplified in linguistic structure. So by vocalizing, infants and young children here change the learning environment by eliciting speech from their caregivers, which is simplified and thus easier to learn from. But all the data that I've shown you so far is actually collected in urban societies. So if we truly want to understand the simplification effect, we have to look at parent-child interactions in more horticultural societies as well. So Midi Casillas collected an amazing data set in Chiapas, so southern Mexico, marked in red here on the screen. The people here, the Tseltal Mayan, are a subsistence farming community. So in this community, children are actually seen as more stoic members of society. So they're not really spoken to extensively. But when adults do speak to their children here, which does happen throughout their daily routines, the speech directed to them doesn't have this same prosodic modifications that you see in many urban societies. And we know that because when you have a naive English speaker come into the lab and you play them clips of Tseltal speakers talking to adults and then talking to other children, these English speakers can't distinguish them from one another, right? So these Tseltal speakers aren't exaggerating the prosody of their speech differentially across child-directed and adult-directed speech. So this is an interesting test case for the simplification effect of contingent speech here. So even if pitch isn't exaggerated, might there be other changes to speech structure when it's directed at children? So here we're looking at data from 10 recordings of children just going about their daily lives, each with 1 hour of completely transcribed speech, child vocalizations, and the mother's speech. We're only looking at mother's speech in this case. And then what we're calling the target child is the one wearing the digital audio recorder shown in red on the screen here. And in this data set, they were between 2 and 36 months of age. So we considered speech when mothers were speaking directly to this target child. So we called that TCDS in the paper, but we're also considering mother's speech to any child. So that's called plus CDS in the paper. So plus CDS here includes both speech to any child and to the target directed child. And we included that because both of them might actually be relevant for the child's learning. Okay, so when we look at whether these mothers simplify their contingent speech to children, what did we find? So first we'll look at the lexical diversity, so the number of unique words in caregivers' utterances which were contingent on their child's vocalizations, compare that to non-contingent. So that's what we see along the Y here, the number of unique words. And on the left, what we're seeing is speech spoken contingent on the target child's vocalizations compared to non-contingent speech. And so when we look at this target-directed speech only, we don't see a difference in contingent and non-contingent lexical diversity. And that's most likely because there actually isn't all that much non-contingent speech directed to the target child. So when parents do speak to this target child, it's really in this rapid turn-taking context. But when we open up and look at and include talk directed to nearby children as well, shown on the right here, we do see a simplification effect of contingent speech. So next, we look at the same comparison, but for mean length of utterance in words, comparing caregivers' contingent utterances to non-contingent utterances. So that's what we see here plotted along the y-axis. And what we see in the mean length of utterance comparison is, regardless of whether we looked at speech directed to the target child or to the target child and children in general, contingent speech is on average simplified, shorter in utterance length than non-contingent speech. And then finally, we'll look at the same comparison for the proportion of utterances which just contain a single word. So does the likelihood of any given utterance from the parent containing a single word differ when it's contingent on child's vocalizations compared to non-contingent? So that's what we see here. So higher, again, on the y-axis here means more simplified, more likely to just be one word in length. And then here again, when these Tseltal mothers produce speech contingent on their child's vocalizations, it's simplified in linguistic structure. And we take this to mean that Tseltal children can regulate the complexity of their speech around them just by vocalizing. So taking these together with our previous results, parents across at least 10 different languages do naturally change the speech that they use when they're responding to child's vocalizations. So from the child's point of view, by vocalizing in social contexts, they can generate opportunities, which makes language easier to learn. So these lexically and simplified adult speech instances give children an entry point into really learning to process the relevant dimensions of the ambient language. And given how widespread these patterns are that we're seeing, it's really possible that this simplification effect of contingent speech may be present in more cultures than we're actually looking at here today. And then finally, so even when there's evidence of cross-cultural differences in child-directed speech at, say, the prosodic level of speech, there can be evidence of similarities in other levels of the speech stream. Right? So these levels can be dissociated from one another. And understanding how these levels of speech directed to children may co-vary and also may dissociate across cultures, and then how this variation actually matters for their language development is really a key future direction for us here with this work. Okay, so I want to thank all of the research assistants who made data collection and transcription possible, the families who participated in this work, huge thanks to them, Miri Casillas, who did all of the Tseltal data collection, and then my mentor, Mike Goldstein, and thanks to you all for listening.